Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the very first Africa-China Initiative event of Fall 2025, featuring several early career African scholars presenting new research on Africa-China engagements and their impacts on peace and security. My name is Yoon Jung Park, and I'm the Program Director of the Africa-China Initiative at Georgetown University. Before I continue to introductions, just a few thank yous. Thank you to the Henry Luce Foundation for their generous support of our activities. Thank you to Brennan Young, the ACI program assistant and my right-hand person. Thank you to Smith and the African Studies program for being home to the ACI. And thank you to the Office of the Vice President for Global Engagement, the Asian Studies program, the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, and to Howard University Center for African Studies for being our event series partners. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce our two of our panelists. The first is Henry Tugendhat, who is the new SOREF Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, working on China-Middle East relations. Prior to this, he was an economist on the China team at the U.S. Institute for Peace. And our discussant is Professor Obert Hotze. Professor Hotze is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Liverpool. Amongst many other hats, he is also the current chair of the executive board of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network. And full disclosure, both Obert and I worked on the USIP program together with Cobus van Staden and Lina Ben Abdallah under Henry's leadership on the USIP project that supported the research that's being presented today. With that, let me turn over to Henry to tell you a little bit more about the program and to introduce our presenters today. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you so much, Yoon. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Yoon, for hosting this fantastic event. As Yoon alluded to, sadly, USIP is functionally speaking no more as of right now. We were an institute that focused on peace building and peace resolution and really trying to avoid conflict wherever we could. We were independent of the US government, which gave us a great deal of freedom to pursue research and programs and activities that we thought were in the interests of the US and its partners. And so we were funded by Congress to act independently in that regard. And so this project was really an outgrowth of that, in that there was often a lot of noise around the nature of Chinese engagements in Africa. And often that noise was dominated by either Chinese voices or Western voices opining on the nature of China's engagements in the region. And so the thrust of this project was really to develop the cohort of the next generation of African thought leaders on these issues, people who'd already been working on some of these issues within their own PhDs and research projects, and effectively fund further work that they could pursue, all of whom conducted fieldwork within the region, all of whom did interviews across their networks and really brought in a wealth of expertise and knowledge that researchers from outside of the continent could never have hoped to have achieved. And so I'm really glad and grateful to Yoon and the Africa-China Initiative to give us a platform to celebrate the fact that we actually reached, we just made it past the finish line on this project when Doge invaded our building. So, I'm glad that we get to celebrate all of the great work that all of our researchers covered over the past year. And we've got some really exciting original contributions here to discuss today. So in broad strokes, we had 12 researchers covering 8 countries. We had Tunisia, Nigeria, Djibouti, Somaliland, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Cameroon, and Kenya. So today we've got 3 of those research projects. We've got Tunisia, we've got Nigeria, and we've got Djibouti being covered. But of course, the Nigeria and the Djibouti is really just where a lot of the fieldwork took place. But really, as you'll find out, Devante, who was doing fieldwork in Nigeria and comes from Ghana himself, was really looking at ECOWAS, and Ibrahim was really looking at IGAD. So it was very much a regional study. So on that, I will just briefly introduce our speakers and hand it over to them to get us started. So firstly, we've got Ibrahim Magara, who comes to us as a postdoctoral student at postdoctoral researcher, my apologies, at Coventry University in the UK. He did his PhD at Loughborough University on IGAD, and so this research project is really going deeper, specifically on the Chinese component of that research. Then we're going to hear from Devante Duncan, who is currently working at the African Union and coming to us from Addis, where he is a special assistant to the Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian Affairs, and Social Development. And he still keeps up his research on peace and security issues within the region, and previously worked at the President's Office in Ghana. And then lastly, we will hear from Hasna Naga, who is coming to us from Tunis, where she has just finished her master's at the University of Tunis El Manar, and this research was part of that work. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I will pass it over to Ibrahim to get us started.
Thank you so much, Henry. I think I'll try to share my slides. And let me know if you're able to. Are you able to see my slides?
Yes.
Thank you.
Maybe you can just put them on presentation mode.
That's okay, right?
Still not on presentation mode, but it's fine.
All right, I'll proceed like that then. As Henry said, this project really springs from my PhD. I set out basically to look at the role of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, peace process in South Sudan following the civil war that broke out in 2013. That was barely under 2 years since the country got independence in 2011. And so in my PhD research, working across the region, field work that went on for over a year, I kept hearing China. As Henry may have mentioned, there's this noise about, I didn't really go to the field to research China, but the idea of China, the role of China, the presence of China kept being an issue that was popping up. So later on, then I decided to go a little bit beyond my PhD to look at the role of China in the IGAD peace process for South Sudan. So my paper basically asks the question, what happens when illiberal peace building retreats? China rises and IGAD becomes the main broker for peace, sort of a broker of peace in the region. So basically, as I said, having researched IGAD peace process in South Sudan, I was really bringing in the element of China, but also bringing the element of we are seeing a decline of the liberal peace building model. I think there is a consensus among researchers in our field that we no longer really talk about liberal peace building. There's a shift from there. So I was then puzzled by these 3 aspects. So if IGAD is leading peace process in South Sudan, there is the China factor, and there is a retreat from the liberal peace building, then what happens, where do we go from there? And my major argument is that IGAD is moving toward a hybrid form of peace. And the hybridity, the way I conceive it, is a sort of stability through elite bargains. There's a strong emphasis on sovereignty, but also there's a strong component of development first, where people are talking about what we need is actual infrastructure, what we need is development, is to lift our people out of poverty. So there's that kind of idea, which I think in the past we had the so-called development security nexus. You kind of feel something like that emerging again, where people are saying we are seeing China developing railways and roads and ports and helping, open up spaces and lift people out of poverty. So there's that strong aspect of then emphasis on stability, which is forged through elite bargains, but also kind of presidents or, bringing development more to the fore. Why does this matter? I think it matters because peace building as we speak today is in a flux. With all the challenges that are going on today, the West is increasingly having less leverage, especially in Africa, and particularly in the region where I'm researching, the Horn of Africa. China and the Gulf states are becoming more present. They're having more security development footprints across the region. But also, I think the South Sudan case remains a very relevant case today, especially because IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, has engaged on mediating every major peace deal in South Sudan since the country got independence. What is the framework? As I may have mentioned, there's a consensus about liberal peace building declining. What was it about? It was mainly focusing on aspects like elections, rights, civil society, justice. But also I've mentioned the liberal hybrid peace. How do I conceive it? It has a component of more emphasis on sovereignty of states. It has a strong emphasis on elite pacts. It has a development first agenda. So why do I call it hybrid? It's because when we look at literature, especially on democracy, we hear about hybrid democracies or hybrid regimes or pseudo-democracies. So there's always a component. I mean, when you look at IGAD, the member states, 9 countries in that part of of Africa, each of them we talk about democracy. So each of them is pursuing a democratic agenda. Each of them is trying to, really spread. So if they're engaging in South Sudan, they'll be talking about a democratic process there. The ultimate end of the peace process is actually to make South Sudan more of a democratic republic. But then underneath, as I said, there are other aspects, other values, other issues that they tend to then engage in. So in that sense, then I wouldn't look at it as liberal, but also I was a little bit wary of using the concept of illiberal, but I thought of there is a hybridity. So there's a combination of aspects of, even if it is just a verbal consensus about democracy as we know it, about liberalism, but there's a component of these other aspects that then are coming into play. For example, IGAD repeatedly frames stability as a precondition for democracy, which mirrors in a way China's peace through development kind of narrative. So you see the overlap between that, where IGAD's own rhetoric then is framed in a way that resonates with what China is saying. Methodologically, my research is based on extensive field work that started in 2019, ended at some point in 2021. I went on to write my PhD. Then later on, during this project, I went to Djibouti to continue with this particular looking at the Chinese aspect. So I have more than 40 interviews, mainly with, they are quite high level. So I target diplomats, IGAD staff, politicians, analysts, and also I did a lot of archival work in Addis Ababa, but also in Djibouti and part across the region. The example that, for example, I can point out, in my interview data, we have somebody saying in Juba, this is the capital of South Sudan, how Chinese funding for infrastructure projects created pressure to keep oil fields secure, shaping how peace negotiations then were sequenced. Because if you're a negotiator from South Sudan and you are looking at the Chinese, who are not very vocal in terms of speaking out at the regional level, but internally they are putting pressure in terms of securing the oil fields, which they have heavily invested in. Then you realize you are negotiating, also factoring in the Chinese interest in that. So what are some of the key findings? I highlighted three major aspects. One is what I call material entanglement. For example, as I said, Chinese companies operate in South Sudan's oil fields, which they have invested massively. So disruptions of these oil fields for them directly affects not only China's interest, but also Juba, South Sudan's budget, because it heavily relies on oil revenue. In 2020, for example, Chinese engineers repaired a key section of the Nile oil pipeline under UNIMIS, is the UN mission in South Sudan, which again has a huge component of Chinese peacekeepers. This development, in a way, that you see a development plus peacekeeping merging together, because for China working within the UNIMIS, but also in their own interest when they engage in this kind of engineering work, they're also talking about we are doing peacekeeping. So then you don't see a clear line between what is the development interest and the peacekeeping aspect. So the takeaway is infrastructure becomes a peace tool in this regard. The second aspect or key findings I get from this research is the normative resonance. IGAD's communiques often stress non-interference. They stress sovereignty of South Sudan, for example, and other member states. During the 2018 Revitalized Agreement, for example, IGAD repeatedly resisted external pressure to sanction elites, the South Sudanese elites. This, in a way, echoes China's principle of no imposed solutions or non-interference, which again, I think scholars like Obert, who is here, has also really worked on. So there's a movement from China's stance, but in a way you see that what IGAD says resonates with what Chinese interest or Chinese approach is. Third and last, IGAD relies on donor funding, but it cannot alienate member states. So the example again, in 2023, when President Salva Kiir, the president of South Sudan, unilaterally dismissed the Minister for Defense, and this ministry was under, according to the peace agreement, was under the opposition or the group led by the co-principal is Riek Machar. And for those who may have idea of what is going on in South Sudan, is being charged currently, is being arrested and was arraigned on Monday. So Angelina Teny happens to be the wife of Riek Machar, but he was removed from this ministry unilaterally. In a way, this was a violation, a blatant violation of the peace agreement. But then what do we get from here? In my view, it's a way where elite bargains are prioritized over strict enforcement. So IGAD didn't really want to enforce or say Salva Kiir has violated the peace agreement. They thought, let's continue having this elite consensus and elite fact. Why is the South Sudan case? On paper, liberal peace agreement with the provisions for elections, for example, justice, we talk about security sector reform, transitional justice, all these aspects are in the peace agreement, and they have been negotiated under the auspices of IGAD. But in practice, elections continue to be delayed. They have been delayed multiple times, I think 3 times. Transitional justice mechanisms remain unimplemented. Civil society is kept at the margins, and the leaders continue to reshuffle ministries, as I said, the case of Angelina, and the security post to preserve balance. For example, recently, Salva Kiir appointed his own daughter to a major role in government. But also we see that, for example, the Joint Defense Board and the Joint Verification Mechanism, which are the mechanisms structured to help the implementation process, are largely dormant, but the government remains intact. So in a way that you see there's a sort of stability, very fragile stability without any sort of transformation. What are some of the key contributions from this research? Empirically, it shows how peace agreements are implemented or hollowed out in practice. Theoretically, it demonstrates how global power shifts, which the West is declining, at least in the Horn of Africa, but China is on the rise. These interact with African preferences to produce hybrid peace outcomes. As I said, it's not so much about China imposing or influencing, but also it's a case of China's interest or posture aligning with what African leaders seem to be interested in. So in a way, it resonates, and they're able then to find China as a more amenable partner to work with. Policy, I think this is a need to warn that this sort of quiet stability, fragile as it is, in South Sudan may look like peace for some people. I mean, when you talk to policy makers in the region, they think this is peace in their way. They take pride of having negotiated peace in South Sudan, but it entrenches authoritarian bargains. For example, the oil revenue distribution has stabilized the elites, but it left ordinary citizens exposed to many shocks. For example, inflation and food security, and we have a huge economic crisis in South Sudan. Implications for scholars, I think, beyond stopping the liberal peace, moving beyond the liberal peace practice, we may need to start paying more attention to emerging trends. And Africa could be pioneering a hybrid peace paradigm model that may be telling us where the peace building architecture is moving towards. For policymakers, I think if they want to engage, they must work with, as opposed to against this kind of reality. And for Africa, IGAD, as an example, is asserting regional agency without a doubt, but often is doing it by consolidating elite bargains rather than broadening inclusion. For example, again, the South Sudan National Dialogue, which was established in 2017, it concluded in 2020, and it's clear. It said President Kiir and Riek Machar, the first vice president, whom I said is now been arrested and charged, they themselves were the main obstacles to peace. The people of South Sudan are clear about that. Yet IGAD continues to structure settlements around these two gentlemen. Closing remarks, I think, and also the agenda going forward in terms of where this research goes, I will end by a question. Is hybrid peace a pragmatic pathway in fragile states, or is it a dangerous shortcut that locks authoritarian leaders in place? This is a puzzle that I invite those of us who are interested in peace and security, especially in Africa, to reflect upon us. And again, I'm saying South Sudan seems to offer a very good example for how peace building will look like across Africa going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. I think we're going to go next to Devante. I believe our third speaker, Hasna Naga, has been having some technical difficulties, so hopefully she'll be able to join us while Devante presents his work. I might also remind our audience that if you have questions, please go ahead and start inserting them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Devante, maximum 15 minutes. If you can keep it shorter, we'll have more time for Q&A. Thank you. Do you also have a slide deck?
Yes, please. I do. Thank you very
Okay.
much, Doc.
Go ahead and share.
Share my screen.
Sorry, can you hit the presentation button at the bottom? There we go. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Devante, as introduced. My research topic was on unpacking the impacts of China's economic engagements with ECOWAS on peace, security, and governance mechanisms in the region. So there's a brief overview of what we're going to look at. Introduction, background to the study, objectives, research questions, theoretical framework, methodology, key finding, analysis, lessons learned, areas of future study, recommendations, and conclusion. So I believe that my research was relevant because at the time ECOWAS was a few months to chalking its 50th anniversary celebration. And I believe it was a good time to soberly, reflect on the journey or the trajectory of the regional bloc. We all do acknowledge that ECOWAS has been experiencing certain challenges lately with the defection of 3 member states, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And I believe that, when this opportunity came from USIP, I grabbed it with both hands because I believe, why not? Because China has for quite some time been ECOWAS's largest partner, and they do play a role in however the bloc functions. And so that is the inspiration behind my presentation. So for the first slide, China's economic engagements have had a defining feature on regional geopolitics, and they influence peace, security, and governance in the region. As I've already said, China is ECOWAS's largest partner through trade, security, etc. So China-ECOWAS relations started 1993, but it was firmed up in 2000 with the launch of the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, where China roped in Africa, including the regional economic communities in the continental body, that is the African Union. Today, China has a mission, not just to Ethiopia, but also to the African Union. And China has demonstrated its commitment to Africa in several ways. I mean, China, fully funded and built the new ECOWAS Commission headquarters. And when you come to West Africa, China also is in the process of building the new ECOWAS headquarters, trying to consolidate all the departments under one roof. So although with every engagement, there are two sides. So I just wanted to analyze how China's economic engagements, help development, and how maybe they influence peace, security, and governance in the region. So that is why my research was hinged on the development security nexus. Next. So what are the objectives of the study? To analyze the modes and key patterns of China's economic engagements with ECOWAS, to explore the effects of economic engagements with ECOWAS and regional peace, security, and governance, to evaluate whether China's engagements with ECOWAS member states conflict with the bloc's broader work or interest, to assess the potential risks and challenges associated with China's engagement with ECOWAS and regional peace and security, as well as governance mechanisms, and to identify the lessons that can be learned from these engagements. So the research questions are, to analyze the key patterns, the effects, how China's, as I said, China's engagements conflict with the broader work of ECOWAS, potential risks, and the lessons that can be learned. So as I earlier stated, my research hinged on the development security nexus. This nexus posits that where there is development, where there's development, there's security, and where there's underdevelopment, there's a likelihood for instability and insecurity to thrive. And this is one of the main theories China uses to operate in its interactions, especially with member states in Africa. So I utilize a qualitative approach. Mostly my research was based in Nigeria, Abuja, where ECOWAS headquarters is located. I went there physically to also interact, because I feel like at the headquarters there's some institutional memory, and that'll be the best place for me to undertake my research. So I interviewed officials from ECOWAS, UNIDR, KIPTC, ACSS, and many more. I got data from interviews, semi-structured interviews, and also from the internet as well. So what were my key findings? So, as I stated earlier, China is ECOWAS's largest economic partner, playing a key role in investment, trade, and infrastructure. Most of my respondents did indicate that, China's engagement with Africa was because of their demand for natural resources. However, the issue with China's engagement with ECOWAS was the non-interference policy, which poses that China does not seek to interfere in the happenings, or interfere in the internal dealings of every ECOWAS member state. So their engagements doesn't place any premium on maybe the governance mechanisms or maybe peace and security. They believe that every member state is sovereign, and they came for, they treat it as such. Also, I found out that China has shifted from becoming merely a norm a country that follows norms to one that shapes them. Why do I say this? So let's go back a bit. So ECOWAS, in its recent struggles with the 3 defecting member states, as ECOWAS's largest partner, I believe that ECOWAS believed that China would back it in the suspension of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso as they undermine the ECOWAS peace and security framework and ECOWAS protocol on good governance by toppling democratically elected governments. And this is when ECOWAS sanctioned these 3 member states. And as the largest partner, ECOWAS would believe that, in my discussion with ECOWAS officials, they believe that China should have backed ECOWAS in this regard. However, China did continue to engage with these member states, irrespective of the bans that ECOWAS placed on them. And in my engagements with ECOWAS officials, they did state that there was no ECOWAS statute that barred partners from engaging with sanctioned member states. However, they would have appreciated it if China sort of told the line ECOWAS was towing. China didn't just do that. China also vetoed at the Security Council when ECOWAS sought to have the United Nations sanction these member states as well. And because China, there was no statute, the ECOWAS hands were tied. But it also sparked a bit of a shift in geopolitics, especially in Africa, dealing with external partners, because when the coup d'etat in Niger happened, it took the United States of America 3 months to officially declare it as a coup. For those 3 months, the United States issued various communiques describing it as instability, words such as instability, ruckus, etc. But this was very unlike the United States, Biden's administration. But I believe that in my research, speaking to some of my respondents, they believe that maybe the US was scared that when they eschew Niger, China would occupy the space. But eventually, the new Nigerian military regime did kick the United States out. But that was a very strange precedent to set by not calling out the regime after the coup d'etat happened. And as I said, that's why Western actors have started to mirror China's approach of non-interference, with the US's even willingness to even stay and work with the military regime of General Chiani. And it brought a broader shift in the influence of global dynamic. So development, peace, and security are interconnected. However, economic growth does not guarantee peace and stability in the ECOWAS region. While the principle of non-interference respects sovereignty, it has had negative effects and consequences for governments and respect for human rights in member states. It has also had impacts on security, because if you look at the amount of aid China has doled out to these sanctioned ECOWAS member states, it has sort of kept them afloat. And if you read the ACLED security reports of 2024, it has shown that insecurity has spiked in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso ever since this military juntas took over. But one would think China will take a note from this, and pull back, but that has not been the case. China continues to consistently engage with these member states, undermining the autonomy of ECOWAS. And so the long-term impacts of China's non-interference policy has been, one, undermining the autonomy of ECOWAS, 2, insecurity. So what are the recommendations? The recommendations, as ECOWAS has struggled 50 years, going forward, ECOWAS should be able to encourage its external partners to put premiums on some of the aid and some of the aid and engagements it doles out to ECOWAS member states. So there should be premiums, maybe good governance, benchmarks such as good governance, security, and peace. Also, ECOWAS partners should align with ECOWAS decisions on member states to uphold the bloc's autonomy and not make ECOWAS look ineffective. And finally, China-ECOWAS engagement on a conditional basis where the support is tied to governance and human rights benchmarks. So in conclusion, although China's engagement with ECOWAS presents a lot of opportunities, there are also risks involved, and ECOWAS going forward should approach these engagements with a strategy that integrates economic partnerships with strong governance and security measures to ensure that the next 50 years, ECOWAS is much better and in a much better place than they are now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devante. It looks like our third presenter, Hasna Naga, is still having some difficulty getting back online. So with that, perhaps I can ask our discussant, Obert Hudsi, to make some remarks about these first two presentations. Hopefully in the interim, we'll get Hasna back online.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Thank you, Devante, for your wonderful presentations. I think they kind of like connect in this way. You are talking about China's engagement with regional organizations, IGAD in the case of Ibrahim, and ECOWAS in the case of Devante. And I think the question that to grapple with is, what is the influence that China has on these regional organizations? And one of the points that was raised by Devante as he was concluding is, how do you balance, and this is a question that perhaps you could also maybe answer at the end, how do you balance what China is doing with bilaterally with members of IGAD and with members of ECOWAS versus what it is doing with the collective of these regional organizations? The impression I get from your presentations is that China seemed to privilege bilateral engagements with member states more than it actually does with these regional organizations. The second thing is this argument about interference, and I think you both kind of like touch on that, but Devante touches on it much more. What sort of interference does China have? Are we talking about interference in terms of, as we understand it, kind of like forcing other states to do what they would otherwise not want to do, trying to change domestic politics and other issues? Perhaps China is not interfering in that obvious way, but as Ibrahim pointed out, by raising issues about protecting its infrastructure, right, in the case of South Sudan, such that when these parties are fighting their wars, they have to keep in mind that they have to protect Chinese infrastructure. And those zones of Chinese infrastructure become the peace zones, whereas there's war everywhere else. And that raises a question that perhaps, Ibrahim, you could touch on, the question of what sort of peace is this? If the peace is only linked, or China's interest is in that you need to protect our infrastructure, you need to protect our investments, what sort of peace is that? Right, we can talk about, and how does IGAD respond to those issues, right? So that such that you don't have the islands of peace and there's war everywhere, and simply protecting that infrastructure. And that touches on this development and leading to peace, that, you need development first and it was going to deal with everything. If the development, mostly sponsored by China, is creating all these complexities that I have mentioned, then whose development is it? Who is benefiting from this infrastructure? Who is benefiting from this oil that is being extracted? Who is benefiting from the engagement that China is having with ECOWAS member states. So it raises these questions, and Devante talks about China as a norm setter. What sort of norms is China setting, right? And how different are they from the norms that other powers are perhaps have been setting? So the question of what sort of peace, this hybrid peace that Ibrahim, you talked about, where you're talking about the elite pacts, the emphasis on sovereignty, development as a means to peace. Like I have mentioned, if this development is centered around China's own investments in those countries and those areas where that investment is kind of like concentrated, becomes the areas where peace is, and all the other areas people will continue to fight, then what is that development resulting in? And is it who's benefiting from it? And I would want perhaps for you to explain a little bit more. I know you have done that a bit. What is different about this? What is different about these elite pacts? What is different about sovereignty? What makes IGAD different from SADC, for instance, where even though there wasn't war in Zimbabwe and there was political conflict and the like, there was emphasis on elite pacts, there was emphasis on sovereignty, and there was emphasis on development, that we need to help Zimbabwe to develop for it to deal with its political problems. So why is it doesn't seem to be very different from what has been happening all along? And I would want to perhaps hear a little bit more on hybrid peace and hybrid democracy, right? When these leaders are talking about democracy, when Abiy is talking about democracy in Ethiopia, when they're talking about democracy in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Somalia, and in different other countries, what sort of democracy are they talking about, and how is that linked to peace? Because in some cases, in the desire to protect that, I want to call it pseudo-democracy that they have, they are actually causing much more conflict in trying to protect that peace. And if China is coming in and saying, oh, non-interference in your internal affairs, deal with your issues as you want to deal with them, what sort of partner is it in bringing about peace within a region like the IGAD region? So the indirect impact of infrastructure on peace is something that I think both of you can also can comment on. My other question would be, and kind of like touching on what Devante mentioned, it seems I would want to hear a bit more about what is ECOWAS contributing in this relationship with China. You have mentioned the economic engagements, what infrastructure development that China is providing in the ECOWAS region. We can talk about its investments within in member states of ECOWAS. But what is ECOWAS as a regional body really contributing in this? What is it bringing on the table, right? You have mentioned that China is constructing a new headquarters for them. How does that mirror what happened with AU? And how does that help in any way that ECOWAS can have a voice in this kind of relationship that it has with China, such that it can be able to try to hold China to account for continuing to engage with Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali? Because like you have said towards the end, you get an impression that ECOWAS is helpless and just leaves China to deal with the member states any way that it wants to deal with it, even though it is against what ECOWAS would want to do. So if China is doing that, right, going against the directives of ECOWAS, what sort of partner does it have, and how does ECOWAS reconcile those issues? Because if those three countries are successful and they can do it without ECOWAS, what's going to stop other countries from saying, oh, well, we can just go ahead and do our own thing and defy ECOWAS because we will have partners anyway, and China is one of those partners. My last point is a colleague of mine, Santino Regiume, talks about strategic alignment, where small states that are dependent on investments, on trade, on infrastructure development from bigger powers, they to some extent try to mimic the rhetoric, they try to mimic the ideologies, the policies, strategies of those powers, such that in order for them to get much more benefit from those powers. So perhaps that IGAD, even though it may not necessarily see China's perspective of how to achieve peace, they will mimic, speak the language of China in order to derive benefits from China, but also mimic the language of European Union in order to get more benefits from the European Union. So kind of like double dipping in some way. Non-interference, sovereignty, elite pacts with China, infrastructure, peace, development as a means to peace, whatever however you may put it, and they get more benefits from China or derive whatever they can derive from China. And then on the other hand, talk about democracy, human rights, and all the like, and get more benefits from the EU. And that goes the same way as well with ECOWAS. So in a nutshell, I would say you bring out something that has been missing, perhaps the engagement that China has with regional organizations or regional economic communities in Africa, and IGAD and ECOWAS are very, I think, important in that. So I'll stop here, but I really want to say thank you for your research.
Thank you so much, Obert. It looks like our third presenter, Hasna, will not be able to join us after all. She's having some technical difficulties and hasn't been able to hear anything, in addition to not being able to voice herself. So this is in some ways an advantage, so that we have a little bit more time to dig into these two papers that really speak to one another in great ways. So let me do this in terms of going forward. Let me give both Ibrahim and Devante a few minutes to respond to Professor Khodzi's comments and questions, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And I will read out those questions, maybe a few at a time, and again, go back to our two presenters. So maybe we go back to and start with Ibrahim.
Thank you so much. I think I will start from where, Obert, you left it. I liked the strategic alignment. I think if I work it from there, then we are trying to, I wouldn't say I have a clear answer to what sort of peace these people are trying to build. But I guess starting from that point, then we're able to work it, backwards to what is going on, like paint the reality. So yes, I mean, recently we had some issue. I think it's going on between the government of Kenya and the United States. There's some investigation at the Senate in the US based on what the president of Kenya said in China. Previously, Kenya has been named a non-NATO major non-NATO ally, something like this, by the US. And then the president of Kenya goes to China and says Kenya is working with China to establish a new world order. And this then, starts debate in the US because, I'm saying this to relate to what you're saying. I mean, these leaders have a way to go to the West and try to align to the West. I mean, this sort of democracy, liberalism, justice, elections, and things like this that are associated with what we've seen historically, the West pushing for in Africa particularly. And when they go to the east, and again, I think there's beyond China, we also have like emerging powers, the Gulf powers, in Russia and all this. So they tend to, in a way, speak to these people, as Obert you rightly said, to try and then, appeal or derive some benefit from these actors. In a way, they don't want to leave any. They don't want to lose the West at the expense of, going the East way. So they try to. There's a sort of pragmatism here. There's a sort of a colleague of mine from Congo says it's like juggling raw liver. They are having this raw liver in their hands and they're juggling it. They don't want it to fall down. And they kind of are aware of this. I think what my research shows is the awareness that these leaders have in relation to these dynamics. And that's why, as I said, having really agonized over this aspect, I talk about hybridity in the sense of there's a combination of aspects or values that are originally emanating or being pushed from the West, but also embracing more of what China seems to stand for. And as I say, there's more, China's stance seems to be appealing because it's easier to tell the publics what matters is actually a road because it's physical. You can see it. You can go out there and move from point A to B. What do you eat democracy? I mean, we've seen these leaders talk about this. We've seen Museveni talk about an election. This is just a paper, it doesn't really mean anything, a ballot. So then demean that, but it kind of in a way resonates with the public who are so deprived. Look at the level of poverty. So there's that aspect where people are then meant to believe actually the reason they are behind, the reason they are suffering, the reason there's war and conflict and insecurity is because they are poor. So if you have somebody who can end poverty and misery, then peace will emerge. So then therefore there's that aspect of this is the sort of peace then you dangle to the people that will bring infrastructure, will bring development, will bring progress. And this will sort of sort out the problems that we have. So there is conflict in the remote South Sudan. It's because it's too remote. It's because there's no sanitation. It's because people have no access to basic needs and all this. So then I think that, as I said, working from there, you kind of have a sort of a feed of the sort of peace they want to talk about. It's never concrete that you can actually name it, but it's a sort of this pragmatism, hybrid sort of reality, which they will speak to based on a particular context and the situation. And this, I want to tie this now back to the first question that you raised, which is a very important question. Why, for example, the bilateral arrangement, China will tend to have more engagement bilaterally. And why is this? Where do you see IGAD, in this sort of bilateral arrangement between what China, if China is doing something in South Sudan in terms of pursuing its oil fields and interest, what does this have to do with IGAD, the regional body? I think the response to this, because something I've really taken a lot of time to examine, is because this institution, something like IGAD, is extremely weak institutionally or structurally. I mean, IGAD doesn't really have even a commission. It just have a mere secretariat. It's more of a platform where leaders convene. So then, therefore, it's very easy. And I think China seems to understand that probably much better than anybody else, that this kind of flow, institutional structural flow, it can actually work in its interest. Because then what you need to know is how do you work with Ethiopia, which is a major actor within IGAD? How do you work with Uganda and with Kenya? And this has a direct influence because at the end of the day, when they convene at IGAD, it's really what filters through is the position of Kenya, the position of Ethiopia, the position of Uganda. So because of that, because the West is historically focused so much on institutionalizing, they talk about, can we have institutionalization of IGAD? But China will look at the cracks and look at, can we work bilaterally with Ethiopia and with Kenya and with these countries? And in a way, this has now an implication in terms of what, when IGAD does like a communique, or when it engages in a peace building process, they are going to send their special envoys. Each president is sending a special envoy, and they directly report to them. So then the influence that China has with a specific individual country, and just to wind it up, the aspect of individualized kind of peace engagements, this is where you find it. Because at the end of the day, again, you want to ask, is this about Kenya? always sit above the president of the Republic of Kenya, working individually, using the institution of the presidents to pursue sometimes their own narrow interest. Finally, the question of why is this different? For example, what China, IGAD is doing in the Horn of Africa with ECOWAS, with SADC. There is a component of hegemony, which is another controversial, I think, aspect to talk about. But unlike South Africa, SADC, where you find like South Africa has a huge role to play within that regional organization, and ECOWAS, where Nigeria, is the big brother. IGAD doesn't have that. There's a way you don't have any clear regional major power within IGAD, so they cancel each other. Sometimes, like the peace process, the first peace process leading to the South Sudan's independence, you find that Kenya played a bigger role. The second part, you find like Ethiopia is playing it. So there's that kind of these regional actors canceling each other, checking each other in a way. And in that way, as I said, China will tend to work with each of them individually and in a way pull some strings behind the. And China is not speaking openly. When you go to IGAD, these summits, you find they come in and sit and observe and listen. And then they know who is speaking what and how can we go to the capitals and influence these processes from behind. So in short, I leave it at that. Those are some of the responses to the questions that you raised. Thank you so much.
Can you unmute and respond to Obert?
Thank you, Dr. Obert. So first of all, the first question was why China would prefer bilateral engagements over the collective. I mean, in my research, I did notice that a lot of the respondents indicated that it's easier to negotiate with member states at that level than the collective. I mean, it's even one of the reasons why China did shift from engaging the AU as a collective to the REX, because it is the needs of member states are different, and each member state would want maybe have a unique request or demand from China, and I think China also did leverage on that to engage with them bilaterally. But in the case of ECOWAS, it has undermined ECOWAS's institutional capacity, especially in the case of the Alliance of Sahelian States, in a case where ECOWAS clearly sanctioned them and expected their trusted partners to sort of back the regional bloc. But that didn't happen with China, because even after ECOWAS sanctioned them, China continued engaging with these member states. China also vetoed a resolution at the UN where ECOWAS was seeking to further sanction these member states. And so I think at that level for China, I mean, it's more leverage and easier to engage on a bilateral level. You also asked what ECOWAS, I think, brings to the table. It's quite unfortunate that off the top of my head, I cannot think of anything, because for the most part, in ECOWAS relationship with China, all we do, even at the member state level, all we do is take. There's nothing we're giving back, because I mean, every year they organize the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. They convene all the member states, African member states, heads of state of Africa to China, and everybody, I mean, they all go. I don't recall a meeting where we sit in Africa, or even in Ethiopia where the headquarters of the African Union is, and call all the world leaders to assemble here. It's never happened before. But every year we go for TICAD, which is in Japan, we go for FOCAC, which is in China, we go to the US, but I don't recall Africa having that convening power to mobilize all these heads of states from the East, from the West, from Asia to Africa. And so, and it's kind of a one-sided relationship, if I would say it that way. That is why ECOWAS especially doesn't really have much leverage. And so China is, I mean, is able to do whatever they want to do. And there's no, as I said, there's no statute that bars partners from engaging with sanctioned member states. I mean, they're free to do as they like. It would have just been ideal for ECOWAS's partners to give the regional bloc some backing when it makes or takes certain decisions, or member states that flout the rules and regulations of the regional bloc. But I don't want us to overstate the impact of China's non-interference policy and its engagement on the happenings in the West African region and the ECOWAS region, because I also believe that ECOWAS has some responsibility, has to take some responsibility. ECOWAS sought to officially institutionalize an additional framework on an additional protocol on good governance. We sought to sort of address the issue of unconstitutional changes of government, whether by military takeover or by illegitimately manipulating the constitution to seek unconstitutional terms, it may be third term, fourth term in different member states. This process started in 2022, and up till now, ECOWAS member states cannot decide and agree to implement this protocol on good governance. Because when you go to Togo, President Faure Gnassingbe has manipulated the constitution, changed it from a presidential to a parliamentary system where parliamentarians choose the president, which means, I mean, he's going to be president forever. You go to Ivory Coast, where recently Alassane Ouattara is going for an unconstitutional fourth term again at his age almost close to 90 years. You go, I mean, then we have Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, I mean, Guinea, under military rule. So the only real beacons of democracy in the region may be Ghana. I mean, Nigeria, that is supposed to be the symbol of hope. I mean, they are not really pulling their weight. Senegal's president is fairly new. So I think ECOWAS also has some part to play in all of this, but I believe that China has undeniable influence in the political and economic landscape of the region, and although ECOWAS must take responsibility for its internal shortcomings, China also has a part to play. And so, I mean, if ECOWAS can review the supplementary protocol on good governance, I think that it would help in this regard. Finally, I think that as ECOWAS enters its sixth decade, I mean, we must adopt a strategic approach, you know, to external partnerships. I mean, we don't have much leverage when it comes to a partner like China, because they are ready to give out, you know, without really asking for much. All they want is really access to the natural resources. They don't really care the internal situations in the countries. And so it's easy. I mean, it's practically easy money, unlike the West, where they have certain benchmarks. And so if ECOWAS is going to reaffirm its role as a regional leader in governance, I mean, we have to take a look at how we approach our partnerships, especially looking at a balanced approach. And I believe that if we can fully implement this ECOWAS additional protocol on good governance, I think it would go a long way to sort of guide our partnership and encourage our partners to sort of attach some benchmarks to these engagements to ensure that, you know, ECOWAS autonomy is not undermined. Because at the end of the day, I mean, we only have one regional economic community in West Africa. And after 50 years, if we don't really have anything to show for, then it's a cause for worry. I don't think the Golden Jubilee should just be a milestone. I think is a call for a reflection and a call for action for more strategic modes of engagement with partners like China. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devante. Let me read out a couple of the questions that are addressed to both of you, and then maybe one more for Ibrahim. Jennifer Bowie, who's a colleague at Georgetown and who is actually our next ACI webinar speaker next month, says, thanks for the presentations, fascinating research from Africa. I am new to the peacekeeping field. I have one question. I notice both researchers refer to China as if it is one decision maker. Do you know which ministry in China is leading the discussions on peacekeeping? Is it similar to the foreign aid led by MOFCOP, or is it led by the PLA? How is it influenced by foreign affairs and MOFCOM? And then one more general question is, given the weaknesses of the RECs, does the PRC just see the blocks as a means to influence states? So those two for both of you. And Ibrahim, one more for you. China is one of several powers competing for influence in the IGAD region. Beyond its oft-cited principles of non-interference and respect for sovereignty, what specific advantages does China hold in this context? So let me have you respond to those three first, and then I have a set of additional questions for Devante. Go ahead, Ibrahim.
Thank you so much. These are fantastic questions. And yes, I think I'll try to give it a go, but I think also probably even Obert could have an input to that, of course, with Devante as well. As Jennifer, I think when you look at China, the approach to peacekeeping and decisions, I think are shared across institutions. The foreign ministry sets the diplomatic position, and the PRA will normally carry out the actual peacekeeping operations. And we look at MOFCON, I think, all the state companies, which are mostly, owned by the state itself, which makes it very difficult to, look at the private sector and the public. They will normally get involved when stability links to development, for example, on issues like infrastructure. So I think at the end of the day, unlike foreign aid, which MOFCON will normally lead, peacekeeping is mainly a foreign policy, PLA kind of partnership, with others playing more of a supporting role, especially the state-led corporations. So I think that's, as I said, colleagues might add to that, but I think that's sort of what I'm seeing, how China is engaging in a peacekeeping terrain. The second question, I didn't get the name, so I take it's anonymous. So, yeah, so I think China's key advantage is really beyond rhetoric. Having researched on the case of IGAD, I think there's something much more beyond just posturing or having this rhetoric about their own interest and positionality. First, there's a deep economic entanglement, which I alluded to in the region. I think you are going to drive around the Eastern Africa region, as is the case with the most of Africa. You're going to see a lot of infrastructural development by China. And I think that starts to resonate, as I said earlier, with so many people, because many people are starting to ask, okay, we've been working with the West for years and years. We do not see these things, but China's come here. We can see a railway line, we can see a port, we can see a road, we can see it. So there's that major aspect which is more concrete, especially when you talk about economy, but also now there's that entanglement which I mentioned earlier within the region, where you see these countries are themselves entangled, their economies are. When I talk about South Sudan, for example, the oil infrastructure, which China's invested heavily, the oil is actually exported through Port Sudan, which is in Sudan. So then if South Sudan depends heavily on oil revenue, which China has invested heavily, it's also entangled between South Sudan and Sudan. And then China gets entangled in that. These two countries are major countries of IGAD, of the regional body. So there's that kind of, for me, this economic entanglement, which is very concrete, very real. That's why I said it goes way beyond rhetoric, beyond posture. So it has both the leverage. We really need to pay more attention to the leverage that China has, which is a strong incentive to stabilize the region. It will have reason why it wants to be there. And I think it's a fact that in South Sudan is where we see China for the first time deploy an infantry force. So that tells you the importance that they attach to this kind of engagement. Second, I think is the when talk about delivery of infrastructure and financing, China does it very quickly. And I think this is another huge aspect. China will actually put these resources in the pipeline very fast and bring it to fruition. I think I'm giving a case of Kenya. They've been talking about a highway which was originally supposed to be done by the US between the two capital, the two major cities, Nairobi and Mombasa. It's taken forever, but China will come in and do a railway and finish and go to another thing. So they're putting resources at the disposal of these leaders. And from that pragmatism, which I said earlier, leaders like this, because then they tend to get these resources. Of course, there are other debates which I wouldn't have the competence to go into, the so-called debt trap and all these kinds of things. But yes, the fact is there's accessible money that China is putting, and they're using this as a lever, and it's working very well for them as at now. Finally, China brings UN peacekeeping capacity through the PLA, which I mentioned earlier, giving it a direct role in security, which it combines. It combines this with this partnership, and therefore it has a way of aligning the three components. Look at them as pillars. You have a direct foreign policy in China, which it can work with companies which are not necessarily private, they are state, but then they can also go to the UN and influence processes from there by putting boots on the ground as peacekeeping. So then there's these capacities across these three major pillars, and this becomes again a major aspect, especially with IGAD. And IGAD seems to prefer stability and things like sovereignty. At least rhetorically, they talk about those things, and those things we tend to resonate with a lot of people because there's a history. I think we didn't really, everybody's aware of legacies of colonialism, of imperialism. So it's easier for China to come and say, look, guys, we never colonized you. We are here as equal partners. We want to do business. We want to help each other. So that does have a huge implication. The last question, maybe can I come to it later? I think I lost the train.
That's fine. There's actually a couple more questions for you as well. So we'll come back to you again. Devante.
Thank you very much, Doc. So the first question, I think Ibrahim has answered it on peacekeeping. The second question, which was, I think, specifically to me, I'm looking.
Sorry, there was a question and I neglected to say the questioner's name. It's Evan Naktrib. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, but he was just asking if, given the weaknesses of RECs, does the PRC just see these blocks as a means to influence states? And I think it links back to one of your final points in your presentation.
Okay,
But,
give me the weakness
actually,
of where.
Yeah.
I would say to some extent, to some extent, I mean, China sees West Africa as a very potential hub for, a lot of these natural resources, and I think that the best mode of entry would be through the entity with the most convening power. I mean, and that's the Regional Economic Community. ECOWAS is even able to mobilize heads of state even better than even the African Union. I mean, that's what RECs particularly do. They're able to mobilize their heads of state. And I think that China recognizes that and sees that as an opportunity. And that is why China shifted from focusing on a continental approach to a regional approach. Initially, I think the SADC was the rec most, I mean, China was the rec China was most engaged with, but now that has shifted to the ECOWAS, with ECOWAS being the only regional economic community China is currently even building a new headquarters for. So I think that if they regard it as a means of entry into, or to sort of announce themselves into the region, because even for the FOCAC, it's easier to convene heads of state rec by rec, and China recognizes this. So I think while they do prefer engaged member states at the bilateral level, the recs provide them with, being able to amass, the heads of states and the member states and convene them together, and be able to penetrate through the region easier. Okay, thank you. The second question, Doc?
Actually, there are a few more specifically for you, Devante. If you give me a
Yeah.
second, maybe you want to jot down. Two of them are refer specifically to other actors in the region. So one of the this is anonymous, but this person says interesting findings about China and ECOWAS, but how much does the West approach to the ECOWAS region speak more about Russia's expanding influence rather than China's approach in the region?
Okay.
And then Gerard Gerard asks, how much does ECOWAS non-intervention speak about its internal inability to intervene in a context where friends of the US have different readings of the coup trends in the region, especially in the case of Niger, rather than because of China's non-interference policy. Does that make sense? So
Yeah,
was it
I'll
about
take the
their,
first one.
okay. And then let me just go ahead and give you one more.
Okay.
With China being such a large shareholder in ECOWAS, would you also recommend the integration of UN member states in such initiatives, or would you discourage this as to preserve autonomy and foreign influence? Discourage this as to preserve ECOWAS's autonomy and further foreign influence. So let me stop with those three.
Okay, thank you very much, Doc. I think the first question, talking about the West approach to ECOWAS, more about Russia's expanding influence and China's approach. While we all recognize that, Russia is gaining ground in Africa, especially with the sanctioned member states. But that has been very recent, very, very recent. And Russia, I've worked in the ECOWAS space, and I can tell you for a fact that Russia has been sort of labeled like a disruptor, if I'll put it that way, because of the damage Russia did in Central African Republic, especially, and what they're doing in Mali, especially. The hiring of mercenaries from the Wagner Group to sort of, provide security with Mali, the Malian government forcing the UN mission in Mali, peacekeeping mission in Mali, to leave. Somehow Wagner has not been able to fill that gap. And there are even reports of Wagner, abusing, and even killing Malian citizens. So while Russia's influence has been loud, China has been subtle. China it's only recently that China started putting boots on the ground in Africa, but China tends to focus more on its economic engagements. Yes, maybe Mali is getting paid Russia is getting paid in Mali by gold, but they prioritize security. Their engagements are mostly security through Wagner Group. But China is subtle. They prioritize their economic engagement. As Ibrahim said, they say, we didn't colonize you. We're here to do business. They tell you they're not like the West. and already with the anti-French sentiment in Francophone West Africa, China feels like a breath of fresh air. And I mean, they give you money, loans, they forgive you loans, with no conditionalities, nothing. And so I think that is one where the West might be panicking. I mean, there's a lot of talk of Russia and France, especially in Francophone West Africa, but I believe that China is the actor everybody should be looking out for. Because, I mean, we are the ECOWAS's largest partner. If you go to every ECOWAS member state, I mean, Russia is not present in Ghana. Russia is not present in Nigeria. Russia, I mean, Anglophone West Africa, there's no Russian presence, but there's Chinese presence in almost all Anglophone West African countries. And so I believe that China has more of a footprint of a stronghold in West Africa than Russia does. And it is sort of, that's why I said it become a norm setter. It has sort of changed the way some of the Western countries have begun to approach some of their engagements with member states in ECOWAS. So I believe that while Russia has also played a part in norm setting, I believe for the most part, China has, because I don't think Russia does not have even the convening power to call all ECOWAS member states or even African member states to Russia for a meeting, but China does. Every year we go for FOCAC, and even sanctioned member states go. You see heads of state, there's not even representative, heads of state go. I don't think Russia has that convening power. The second question, with China being a large shareholder in ECOWAS, shareholder might be a bit problematic, would you also recommend the integration of UN member states in such initiatives, or would you discourage this? I think I wouldn't recommend the integration of UN member states in such initiatives. I believe that, I mean, Africa should be able to stand on its own. We are not saying that China is necessarily bad. We are just calling for a balance in terms of ECOWAS's engagements with China. Foreign influence has been there for a while. It still is going to be there for a long time to come. It's just quite unfortunate, but I think, in this time and age, Africa, I mean, for West Africa, for that part, has, developed growing resentment for the West. And I mean, in terms of colonization, in terms of our, engagements that have reaped little to no benefits. You take France, for example. I mean, in Mali, in Niger, Burkina Faso, we hear the uproar. Even in Senegal, the French are being forced to close down all their bases. And so I don't think that the answer to China's dominance in Africa is to counter it with maybe the West, because I don't think that's going to work. I think they had their chance, and the people don't really seem to connect with or resonate with the kind of engagements that the West proposes. So I do believe that we need to emphasize on the fact that, Africa member states are autonomous. ECOWAS is autonomous. ECOWAS should be allowed to function free of external influence. But then again, that also leans a bit towards China's principle of non-interference, that we should leave maybe African solutions to African problems. But in a case where, China is certainly undermining, the autonomy of ECOWAS by engaging with member states that have clearly gone or contravened the principles and statutes of ECOWAS, then that begins to turn into a problem. And so ECOWAS should be allowed to act as the global hegemon in the West African space by dictating to its member states, allowing member states to adhere to the principles and statutes of the regional bloc. So I wouldn't recommend the integration of other member states to counter what China is doing per se, no. I think that ECOWAS is open for business. but as long as you respect the statutes and maybe rules and regulations of the bloc, I think that all will be well. The final question.
I think that was it,
With-
Devante.
Okay, I
Okay.
see more questions. Just
Oh, there are more questions. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We could probably stay on for at least another half hour and
can I just
continue
answer
these
one
conversations.
question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I
Go
see
ahead.
one question which is very interesting. Why China not wanting to interfere with the autonomy of ECOWAS member states? With China not wanting to interfere with the autonomy of ECOWAS member states, why is it not contradictory that they voted against the sanction that ECOWAS proposed? Okay, so in theory, I believe that China's non-interference principle is not pragmatic. I believe that, I mean, in theory, they say they don't interfere with ECOWAS, but I believe I selected not a non-pragmatic because once you veto a resolution that ECOWAS tables, you're also interfering. But I'm sure they'll say, or maybe they're proposing Malian solutions to Malian problems, or Nigerian solutions to Nigerian problems, or Burkina solutions to Burkina Faso problems. But vetoing a resolution from ECOWAS, one, does not only undermine it, it also sort of interferes with the work of ECOWAS, because ECOWAS not just works in the interest of one member state, but all member states. And given how we've seen military regimes even handle security in the region, it's a cause for alarm, because we know that threats normally travel over shorter distances. And so, I mean, you have, insecurity at its peak in Mali. You see people being displaced internally. It affects other member states, because then it becomes a whole refugee situation. You have people leaving Mali, to maybe Ghana or other member states, and it becomes a problem for the host government. So while I believe that I believe that China's vetoing of ECOWAS's resolution of the United Nations under the principle of non-interference was very selective and non-pragmatic. It doesn't really, properly outline the principle of non-interference, because in a way they did interfere, and they didn't allow ECOWAS to explore all avenues to curb this issue of military takeovers in the region. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for in the audience for sticking with us for the full 90 minutes. I want to thank our two presenters, Ibrahim Magara and Devante Duncan, as well as Henry and Obert, for bookending this section for us. And I hope you will join us for the ACI webinar, which will be on Friday, October 24th, featuring Jennifer Bowie on a presentation of a new report on China's health initiatives in Africa. Thank you all very much. And we will find an opportunity for Hasnan Naga and the two other USIP African researchers to present in a final early career scholar panel, hopefully in January. Again, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next ACI event. Thank you, everybody.